The election of a new pope brings with it two fundamental questions. The first, and without a doubt the most important, is who will be chosen to sit on the throne of St. Peter. The second, though perhaps less urgent, is just as intriguing. It's a curiosity that has sparked debates, conversations, and even betting pools around the world. What name will the new pontiff choose? Will he call himself Francis II, perhaps Benedict XVII? Or will he lean towards something more traditional, like John Paul III, Paul VII, or even John XXIV? Or maybe, just maybe, he'll surprise everyone and choose a name no pope has ever used in the history of the Church. The tradition of selecting a papal name is ancient, rich, with symbolism, history, and fascinating meaning. So come with me, let's explore this compelling topic full of little-known details and historical twists. First, we need to understand something crucial. Taking a new name isn't a requirement, it's a tradition. There's no written rule that says a pope can't keep his birth name. But over the centuries, this custom of choosing a different name has grown stronger. So much so, it's become an unwritten rule inside the Vatican. If we look back to the early centuries of Catholicism, we'll see that many popes used names that eventually faded from use. Some were so unique, or so unusual, that they were never heard again in church history. That all began to shift in the year 533, when a man named Mercurius was elected pope. Yes, you heard that right. Mercurius, the Latin name for Hermes, a pagan god from the Roman pantheon. He likely understood that having a pope named after a pagan deity didn't exactly align with the values of the Christian faith. So he made a bold and unprecedented decision. He gave up his birth name and chose a completely different one. That's how Mercurius became Pope John II, the first pope in history to take on a new papal name. To this day, we don't have any official records or clear documentation that explain exactly why he did it. At least none that have survived. Even so, historians agree that the main reason Pope John II changed his name was to avoid any association with pagan mythology. Instead, he chose the name of a previous pope, one that better reflected the Catholic faith. Interestingly, there had already been a pope named Dionysius before him, another name linked to a pagan deity. But we'll get to that part of the story a bit later. Although John II was the first pope to officially change his name upon being elected, his decision didn't immediately spark a consistent tradition. In fact, many of the popes who followed him returned to the older practice of keeping their birth names. That's how we get names like Pope Agapetus, Pope Silverius, Pope Vigilius, and Pope Pelagius, among others, all of whom used their given names as popes. Later came Pope John III, a fascinating case. He was also known as Catalinus, though it's still unclear whether that was a surname, a nickname, or his actual birth name. If it's confirmed that he changed his name, then he would have been the second pope to do so. That happened in the year 561. Still, for nearly 4 more centuries, the overwhelming majority of popes continued to use their original names. It wasn't until the year 955 that another major shift occurred. That's when Pope John XII, originally named Octavian, chose to change his name. And from that moment on, the tradition began to gain real momentum. Some of his successors still held on to their birth names, but increasingly, more and more popes chose to adopt new ones. In 983, Pope John XIV became the 4th pope in history to take a new name. And in his case, the reason was profoundly symbolic. He was born with the name Peter, and he believed it would be inappropriate to assume the name of the apostle, who according to tradition was the very first pope of the Church. To this day, no pontiff has ever taken the name Peter II out of deep respect and reverence for St. Peter, the rock upon which the Church was founded. From that point forward, changing one's name became such a well-established tradition that only 2 popes since then have chosen to keep their birth names, Adrian VI in the year 1522, and Marcellus II in 1555. And Marcellus II remains to this day the last pope in history to keep his original name upon being elected. Since then, every pope elected has adopted a new name. And that name represents not just a new image and a new legacy, but sometimes the beginning of an entirely new era for the Church. That's how this ancient tradition became firmly established. Now, you may have noticed that I've mentioned the name John quite a lot, and that's no coincidence. John is the most commonly chosen name in papal history. It was the name selected by 21 officially recognized popes, making it the most repeated of all. But maybe you're wondering, what about Pope John 23? Shouldn't there be only 21? Well, here's where things get a little complicated. If we look at the list of popes, we see John the First, John the Second, and so on all the way to John 15. But then, we jump straight to John 17. So what happened to John 16? He simply vanished from the official records. That's because he was later considered an anti-pope, a pope who was never officially recognized, the result of a rebellion. After being deposed and captured by enemy forces, he was brutally punished. His tongue was torn out, his fingers broken, and his eyes gouged. He died 2 years later as a monk, yet for a time he was treated as a legitimate pontiff. So much so that the next pope to take the name John respected the numbering and became John 17. The tradition continued with John 18 and John 19. Then came another twist, this time a simple clerical error. A scribe accidentally skipped John 20. There never was an official Pope John 20, so the Church moved directly to John 21, a Portuguese pontiff who accepted the number as it stood. He was followed by John 22, and much later in modern times, John 23. But here's another twist worth noting. The name John 23 had already been used once before by an anti-pope during the chaotic 15th century, a time when multiple claimants fought for control of the papacy. That anti-pope was later removed from the official list, which means technically, we've had two John 23, one recognized by the Church and one erased by history. In short, there have been 21 popes named John, all officially recognized, plus 2 anti-popes also named John, and of course 2 popes named John Paul. There's even a popular legend about a mysterious figure known as Pope Joan, a supposed female pope, though that story is still the subject of heated debate. Even so, the name John reigns as the most influential and most repeated name in the history of the papacy. And why is that? Well, Pope John 23, the most recent pope to use that name, gave us a clear hint when he explained his choice. John was the name of 2 of the men closest to Jesus, John the Baptist, the prophet who prepared the way for the Messiah, and John the Evangelist, the beloved disciple and author of 5 books in the New Testament. To Pope John 23, the name was deeply inspiring. But more importantly, and this is the key point, each time a pope chose that name, the name itself seemed to grow in prestige. The association between John and honorable, admirable figures only grew stronger. It created a kind of domino effect. Future popes would adopt the name in hopes of aligning themselves with that spiritual legacy. Of course, not every Pope John lived up to the name. Pope John XII, for instance, died after being caught in bed with a married woman. Still, overall, the name John came to symbolize continuity and a reverence for the earliest roots of the Catholic faith. And without a doubt, it will continue to be used. Now, while the name John has been used over and over, there are other names that have appeared only once in the entire history of the papacy, especially during the early years when popes still used their birth names. That's how we ended up with Pope Dionysius, the 25th Pope, way back in the 3rd century. And that's fascinating because Dionysius was the name of the Greek god of wine celebration and ecstasy, the complete opposite of Catholic Christian sobriety and restraint. So yes, it's quite curious that a pope once bore that name. But back then, many pagan names were still circulating among early Christians. And since the custom of changing one's name as pope didn't yet exist, Pope Dionysius simply kept his given name, which at the time was fairly common. It's important to remember that Pope Dionysius lived before one of the most pivotal moments in Christian history, the conversion of Emperor Constantine. In other words, he led the Church during a time when Christianity was still persecuted, still considered illegal, not yet the official religion of the Roman Empire. It was a period of formation both in terms of doctrine and structure. Within the inner history of the Catholic Church, there have been several popes with names that today might seem unusual. There was Pope Hilarius, Pope Gaius, Pope Miltiades, Pope Simplicius, Pope Gelasius, Pope Donus, Pope Zachary, Pope Formosus, Pope Romanus, and Pope Lando, who was elected in the 10th century. And speaking of Pope Lando after him for over 1,000 years, every pope either chose a previously used name or happened to be born with one that was already considered papal. That long-standing pattern remained unbroken, until something unexpected happened in 1978. That year, Pope John Paul I made a unique choice. He created a brand new papal name by combining the names of two recent giants of the Church, John XXIII and Paul VI. Even then, it was still a fusion of names that had already existed. But who was the one to truly break with tradition and choose a name that had never been used before in the history of the papacy? That would be Pope Francis, elected in 2013. As you may know, Francis didn't name himself after any previous pope. Instead, he chose the name of a Saint Francis of Assisi, a man known for his humility, simplicity, and radical love for the poor, virtues the new pope deeply admired. And that choice answers a question I get asked often. Why has there never been a Pope Luke or a Pope Matthew? The answer is actually quite simple. When a pope selects a name, he usually does it as a tribute, a public declaration of the person or legacy he wants to align with, or the spiritual path he hopes to follow. And that's how it's been since Pope Lando all the way back in the year 914. Only Pope Francis took a different route. He chose a name no pope had ever dared to use before, but he did so with deep meaning and a clear message about what kind of leader he intended to be. Pope John Paul I, on the other hand, chose to honor both John XXIII and Paul VI, two towering figures who had led the Church through profound reforms during the Second Vatican Council. Now let's talk about Luke. Even though Luke is the name of one of the most important evangelists in Christian history, it has never been chosen by a pope, not by those who kept their birth name, nor by those who adopted a new one upon election. The same is true for Matthew. And because no pope has ever used those names, there's no papal legacy attached to them, and that more often than not becomes a decisive factor when choosing a name. Of course, there's nothing stopping a future pope from calling himself Luke. As we saw in the movie Angels and Demons, anything is technically possible. But as you've probably noticed by now, tradition carries enormous weight in the papacy, and so do precedents. And then there's the matter of why we've never had a Pope Peter II. That's no accident either. There's a strong, though unofficial, tradition that no pope should ever take the name Peter. Why? Because in Catholicism, Peter is considered the first pope, the apostle to whom Jesus said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Now, not all Christians share this view, but it remains a cornerstone belief in Catholic tradition. And we'd love to know what you think. Do you believe the Apostle Peter was truly the first pope? Let us know in the comments. Over the centuries, Peter's role has become unique, sacred, untouchable. Choosing the name Peter II would be seen as putting oneself on the same level as the apostle himself. And that would come across as excessively bold, if not outright arrogant. So refraining from using that name has become a form of silent respect, one that no pope to this day has dared to break. Seen from this perspective, it's easy to understand why certain names never returned. Names like Lando Hilarius Romanus or Dionysius no longer carry the symbolic weight needed to inspire successors. Perhaps they didn't leave behind a legacy strong enough to echo through time. There's also another important factor. Sometimes a papal name is avoided because of its association with controversial eras or scandals in church history. What's fascinating, though, is this. The Church has never officially banned any name. That means, technically, the next pope could call himself Peter II. Or even choose an unthinkable name like Judas, of course. While technically nothing is forbidden, some choices are simply unthinkable, at least when it comes to Catholic tradition, symbolism, and faith. So yes, a name like Judas might not be officially banned, But realistically, it's as close to impossible as it gets. And now, after exploring all of this history, legacy, and mystery, we're left with one big question. What will be the name of the next pope? Do you have a guess? Any predictions? Let us know in the comments below. I leave you with that thought and a couple more videos that dive even deeper into the hidden truths of church history. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Following Christ channel. Thanks for watching. God bless you, and see you next time.